And good morning, everybody. Everyone's so quiet. My name is Chris Jackson. I'm an architect at Microsoft, and I'm our worldwide lead for enterprise application compatibility. And kind of got involved speaking with packaging folks as part of this App Compat work for a couple of reasons. Number one, I noticed that nearly every App Compat project kind of got dumped on the packaging team for some reason. I guess because they were already handling the applications anyway. Kind of never asked for the job, but got it, and then had to figure it out. The other issue we started running across was that around 60% of the application issues we came across had to do with the packages. And so when we start thinking about packaging, the question that comes up is the innovation gone? Are we done building new and interesting things when it comes to packaging? And I started looking around to find slides that I could find that I thought really were insightful into what the packaging framework was, and this was the most recent one that I found, which was built by the Office team as they were developing the packages for Office 2000. I said, okay, maybe there's a good article somewhere. This is the most recent, really in-depth technical article I could find on the Windows Installer Framework, circa 1998. And I said, all right, so it seems like this stuff has been around for quite a long time, and we're not really talking about it too much just yet. And so, since things have been fairly stable, it would seem that we probably should have gotten really good by now, so therefore we don't need to have this event. So with that, have a nice day. But what I've noticed is that the number of years you've been doing something doesn't necessarily translate into high levels of performance. And this is something we've been looking at both from a product perspective as well as from a services and approach perspective. Doing something a long time doesn't mean you're great at it. For example, this guy's been golfing for a number of years. This guy has also been golfing for a number of years. One of them is better. And we wanted to look at, well, what makes people really fantastic versus just out there doing it to get the job done, right? What delivers better results? And we found that people are no longer being aspirational around what they want to do. Once you learn how to make a package at all, people stop learning. And it's based upon the way in which we learn. We start off, we don't know how to do it. If you can remember the first time you started building packages, right, you had to figure out how the tools worked, how the platform worked, and you started to figure that out eventually. And eventually you started doing it on autopilot. You just kind of get in the zone and you begin to plateau. And you stop getting better. And the reason you do that is based upon human psychology. When we are in the zone, if you will, these are the brain waves. On the right-hand side, you're in the zone. On the left-hand side, you don't know what you're doing yet. It's deeply satisfying to be doing something out of habit. It's very addictive for the human personality. And this has been fairly endemic, right? We look at what the packaging space is like. It was commoditized back in the mid-2000s. People started saying it should all be offshore, right? It should all be from the cheapest vendor. I don't want to pay a lot for my packages because it's something that anybody can do. What they've been finding in the past couple of years, and I'm assuming you're probably seeing the same thing, is that what they got back was crap. It didn't work well over time. It didn't make anybody happy, and they're starting to take it back in-house. There are more packagers working locally today than we've had in a long time because they are tired of this sense of, I can just barely build one, and that's good enough. So how do we overcome the same challenges? It comes through deliberate practice. We need to figure out how to challenge ourselves to continue getting better, not just to make a package, but to continue to focus on what are the things that we're not doing really well yet. Because there is a difference in how people approach their work. If you look at a terrific professional musician, they don't just sit there and play the songs they know by heart. They do tedious exercises that warm their fingers up. If you look at a professional ice skater versus an amateur, once they've mastered a jump, will just do it over and over again because it's fun. A professional will do the one that they miss over and over again until they get it right, And then they'll find the next one that they can't do and practice that. And we need to think about how good can we get? And we'll get to defining good momentarily, but we need to think about that. I love this quote because this is so telling. Roger Bacon in the 13th century said, "No one can obtain proficiency in the science of mathematics by the method hereto known unless he devotes to its study 30 or 40 years. He was saying, to master mathematics, you need 40 years of continuous study, back in the 13th century. Today, our junior high school students or middle school students, 7th and 8th grade, they've mastered everything in mathematics that was known by Roger Bacon. And they're not even teenagers yet. So we can continue getting better. This is a plot of the time taken to run the 100-meter dash over time. The best in the world in 1912 runs significantly slower than the best in the world today. And that's not because we're a different kind of human, it's because we're starting with the knowledge that already is out there and we're moving forward. This is what we need to apply. And we need to figure out how to start learning from this because there's the potentially a very huge financial impact. What it takes to be constantly doing packages and having them be negative quality. There's this tendency, and I certainly notice it in the deals we do from Windows 7 migrations. All of your packages have to be done over. I've seen it time and time again. And if you look at that, we estimate there are roughly around 19,000 enterprise organizations worldwide. A typical well-managed enterprise has on the order of 2,500 applications. Well-managed, right? I've seen worse. My current world record holder for the worst application management of any company is an organization of about 30,000 people with 130,000 applications. That doesn't include websites. That's just installed Windows apps. Worst in the world that I've come across so far. But well-managed, they get to around 2,500. And if we look at an average worldwide cost of around $522 for a package, redoing these things, particularly if we want you to do it once a year, means that every year the world annually will spend on the order of $2.5 billion redoing stuff. Make no mistake about it, this is an industry based on rework. This stuff came from the software developer in a package, and we've said this is not good enough, we're going to do it over. $2.5 billion of do-overs, people probably don't want to do that every year. And there's a lot of do-overs that are draining money from us. We actually did an estimate of what we think it costs to move the world from Windows XP to Windows 7, and oh, by the way, we're not done yet. There's still about 26% market share. Total projected cost of that transition was over $1 trillion US. And a lot of that's rework. So this is a significant opportunity to start redirecting money from rework to moving the world forward on technology, because rework's not so fun. We need to seize the opportunity to not suck. And that comes from figuring out how to differentiate, not just on price, right? There's still people who will pay for the lowest bidder. But how do you differentiate on quality? And how do you define quality? Because there really isn't a sense of what quality means. Typical quality criteria is this one. I have one person, they said it works, therefore they've signed off, and I get my check. With no measure of how well those things do over time. Here's an interesting statistic. We look at our SQIM data, which is what the Customer Experience Improvement Program. We call it SQIM, which stands for Service Quality Metrics. On average, 8% of all application installs fail in the enterprise. It means nearly 1 out of every 10 times someone tries to install software using a package whose sole job is to install software, it doesn't install software. If 1 out of 10 days I just chose not to show up to work, I probably wouldn't have a job. And yet we seem to tolerate this. And we tolerate it because we are divided when the event happens, right? significantly after the package was delivered from when the package was delivered, and we don't have a feedback loop. How do we come across having some sense of sustained engineering, where we keep track of how well these things are doing, and when they fail, analyze why they failed? Is it because we have a packager who doesn't know what they're doing? Is it because we have an assumption about the environment that's wrong? Is it the environment misconfigured? It's not always the package's fault. There could be something wrong. And we need to figure out how to understand that and make it better by building checklists. And not just building checklists that have the basics. When I look at the package request forms that I see from most partners, including us, right? Our consulting organization builds them as well. What do they ask for? They certainly define very, very clearly the package naming convention. I've never had one that wasn't really exhaustive and thorough in defining how to name a package. What's the overall financial impact of a terrific name in a package? It helps organize it, but probably not huge. When we look at when we've actually built really effective checklists, the first one we did that was hugely effective with a huge gain was in the airline industry. Right? There was what eventually became the B-1 bomber. Right? They took off in Seattle. Shortly thereafter, they crashed the plane because it was the most complex plane that had ever been built, and they simply forgot to unlock their ability to steer the plane, which it turns out is rather helpful when you're flying an airplane. They were locked. They forgot to do it because it was the most complex thing they'd ever done. So what did they start doing? They started building checklists. That's why every pilot has one. Used to be big books. Now they're putting them on tablets more and more so they can keep track of what has to be done. Took the same idea into the concept of medicine. What causes people in surgery to die? And how do we fix that? Some really effective things such as, did you introduce yourself to the other people on your team you may not have met? Believe it or not, one of the most effective remediations. These are the kind of checklists based on data. When we do this, quality goes up over time, not just my ability to get it signed off on, and taking some long-term accountability to build better packages. The next question is, how do I build those packages? Quality matters, and I need to figure out ways to build that. Where's it going? And look at where we came from, right? Setup.exes. Typical failure rate for a setup.exe was somewhere on the order of 25%. Why? Because you had millions of lines of arbitrary code that would hit environments it wasn't tested on, and so they would fail. Which is why, when the Windows installer came out, people jumped on it because it dropped down to about 8%. I had one customer that was at a 20% failure rate, dropped to 5%. Right? There's one example of a specific customer after making that one transition, and it mapped up fairly closely to what we saw as the averages. Why? Because, barring custom actions, which I'm not very fond of, it's a database going through highly, highly tested code. And then we look at what's come next. App V. Failure rates are very low. Why? It's a single file copy. So I don't have to run logic at all, which means the logic can't fail. It's all about making things easier, fewer moving parts. Why is a jet engine so effective? Because there's almost nothing in that thing that's moving and prone to failure. Unless you throw a bird through it. That's not so good for them. And the next place that we're going is something called open packaging conventions. We're not quite there in packaging yet, but if you look at where packaging is going, here is an AppX file. And if I rename it to zip, I can open it up, and I can see, oh, in this application pack, here is a manifest, here's a signature, and here's a bunch of content. This happens to be a JavaScript app. Here's the actual code itself, and I can look at what's inside of it. I'll just pop it open in Notepad. Here's some XML. And it's going to define this element, here's where it comes from, here's how big it is with checksum, so I can ensure that the content is there and it's in good condition. But it's all in a standards-based format, originally developed for the Office applications. Now, what we've been doing recently, we don't have anything super exciting to show on this yet, but I can give you an update of where we are. This is what we believe to be the direction that we're taking all content delivery. We originally invented it for the new XML-based file formats for Office. So the Office formats are based upon open packaging conventions. We use it for App V, starting with 5.0, the new App V file format. That's just a zip file that contains, block map, a manifest, file data, as well as, here's the actual content itself, the virtual file system, here's program files x86, here's the app, all sprayed out there. A very descriptive, standards-based, easy-to-understand mechanism of delivering content. That's how we deliver App V now. And we've been working on, I guess I already had PowerShell typed in there, desktop. A new way of creating these, which we call CoApp. So if I open this up in Notepad, CoApp is in essence today a domain-specific language. And the implementation we have today is an ability through this domain-specific language to transition from this very clear, very terse format into a NuGet package, which is a plugin for Visual Studio designed for developers, again using, you guessed it, open packaging conventions as a way of delivering content in terms of reusable source code for developers. Now, the team that's been working on this is based out of the server group. It's an open source team, so all of this is open source. If we go to coapp.org, you can see in his most recent announcements here that they're actually working with standards bodies to start to build standards, right? And how are we putting it done? And the actual working group on this is ISO 19770/2 to start looking at building some standards. So there actually is some innovation coming, and this is the direction that it is. So if you're not aware of open packaging conventions, I believe that to be a significant part of where packaging is going, right? All part of an total story that starts with an installer, open source, that's Windows Installer XML, NuGet, open source for developers, and CoApp, designed to ideally, eventually, start to bring back some innovation into package delivery so we can start to look at some really interesting scenarios such as offline application installs. Take a WIM file, drop an app on it, and don't have to wake it up, right? Some really interesting stuff we can't do today. The other thing that we're looking for is better support for different scopes of installation. How do we install apps? Just a few years ago, everything was installed per machine. It was actually fairly difficult to find something installed per user. There are all kinds of really interesting scenarios for per user installs. ClickOnce is a per user install technology. AppX files in Windows 8 are per user install technologies. There are very interesting scenarios for that, as well as a pure local scope limited to one particular location. So as we start thinking about where installs are going, thinking outside of the MSI, installing per machine, and trying to fit how you install things to the right solution and the right technology is the direction that I see really being where the interesting stuff is happening. So from a packaging perspective, think about quality. Think about how you can build checklists, how you can measure. I was actually talking to the Admin Studio guys, not to give them a plug or anything, but they said, you know what, we already have that in our product. The problem is no one's using it, right? But they can track that success rate over time. That, I think, really matters. So from packaging, now we've got to make sure that the contents of our stuff actually work. let's talk about application compatibility. I am the App Compat Guy, so it seemed inevitable we would end up here. A lot of packagers end up being involved in compatibility. Where are we today? Well, we're still not done getting off of XP. I thought it was really kind of humorous that in the opening section as we're going through the products, we did see a screenshot of the training site that was IE8 running on Windows XP. That was awesome. Thanks for that. We should move that machine forward. I think we've done a really terrific job of turning the ship around. I think we have more work to do. Here's where I think the state is. Post-Windows 7, even post-Windows Vista, I think we've solved half of the problem pretty well. Right? Here's the problem we've solved really well. What's the cost of remediation? Remediation, moving from Windows 7 to Windows 8, is pretty easy, pretty cheap. Remediation from Windows 8 to Windows 8.1 is pretty easy and pretty cheap. Not many things break, mostly because the innovation we were building was not in the desktop world. We weren't making a lot of breaking changes. We were adding a whole new way to build apps, and that's where we spent most of our engineering time. So it's easy to keep moving forward on that perspective. The same with the web. Statistically speaking, the number of applications that I've had to recommend you have no solution but to change the code to move from IE8 to IE9 has, worldwide, since we shipped it, been 4. IE9 to IE10, 3. So really, really small percentage-wise, because we have a technology built in called document modes. Makes it really easy to move forward on that. But the fact that it's really easy, really cheap to fix it doesn't mean our job is done. Because we still have to find those that are broken because we don't always default you to a working site. You may have a really cheap remediation to put in place, but you still have to discover that it needs to be remediated, which means you still have to pay to go and find it. That's our next frontier. How do we figure that out given the really old stuff that we have? So I wanted to spend a couple minutes taking a look at that and kind of seeing where we are. And I can kind of take this in one of two different directions. My experience is that once you're on Windows 7, the biggest obstacle we see is not Windows apps anymore. It's web apps. And it's what we see time and time again. There's a global alarm going on right now, if you will, because we announced a few months ago that for Office 365, we will no longer be supporting IE8 starting on April 14th of 2014. Now, we subsequently have come back, and I'm not sure how far the word has spread yet, but we've come back and said, you know what, let's be really clear on this. These are the areas that will have a degraded experience. So it's no longer just doesn't support it, you're on your own. It's like, all right, here actually is what's going to kind of be terrible for you, and here's what's going to be okay. So you can make a more informed decision, right? I felt that we owed that, and so we campaigned and actually got that concession and distributed that, or are distributing it in the middle of it. Nonetheless, people still loved what they did before, which is I latched onto Windows XP and IE6 back in 2002 or so, and I held on to it for a decade. Boy, I'd love to do that again. Why can't I do that again for Windows 7 and IE8, and all of a sudden we're making it move forward? So that's the obstacle I see. So when we think about web apps, the one thing I wanted to quickly explain was, oh, that's fantastic. There's nothing wrong. Was the technology that we've put in place. Now, I had a really terrific demo I actually debugged it on Tuesday, and it was broken yesterday. I tested it at midnight, and they'd fixed it, which is really irritating. So I guess the government in Denmark can be proud of what they've done. Oh, that's even more awesome. That's supposed to be broken also. This one, I think it depends on which server I hit. Don't tell me this one's fixed now, too. It's the problem with using live web demos. There we go. That's what I was hoping to see. Is that sometimes you occasionally hit servers that have been fixed or patched or whatnot. I'm going to do a quick web demo. This is a live production out in the world applications at gomockingbird.com/mockingbird. This is the kind of thing we're starting to see over and over again. The number one challenge we see time and time again are challenges with applications that are checking for a specific version of things. One of the issues I came across this week, I can show you because it's just a bunch of source code, is, let me go find it. Actually, I'll just do a web search. Actually, no, I put a shortcut on my desktop to save myself some time, and then I forgot I put it there. There we go. Why are you not opening? All right. Now I can go there. I'll just do a search for it. This is part of the Deploy Java toolkit designed to help people get Java in there. And what it is doing is it's going through and trying to determine things like, oh, non-IE browsers, they're all good. And if browser is IE, then I'll test it this way. And they test it by trying to find if the characters MSIE are in the user agent string. This was an interesting trade-off that we had to make. The user agent string for IE 11 does not contain the characters MSIE. Because we're seeing this problem. So if you start to look across the board at what the challenges remain, one of the challenges is not that applications flat out don't work across the board, because that's not true. The challenge is that they're checking to see what are they running on, and if they don't find something familiar, they're refusing to run. And a big challenge we found in the web world was lots and lots of applications were behaving terrifically on Chrome and Firefox. Believe me, I hate getting those emails. And then what I do is I go and take a look, and I'm like, okay, so the HTML that the web server is giving to Chrome, we would render terrific. Except they don't give us that HTML. They give us some really crusty old HTML designed for IE6, which our new rendering engines choke on. We want you to give us the stuff that you're giving to everybody else, and we'll all do great, right? This is the concept of same markup. So we removed MSIE, and tons of public websites all of a sudden lit up and started working and giving us the same HTML they gave everybody else. The challenge in the enterprise? Lots and lots of websites check to see if you're IE, and if you're not IE, they don't give you anything. My favorite challenge, the most irritating thing, is that ASP.NET, which broke for IE 10, if you happen to have deployed that one, broke again for IE 11 because it's also looking for MSIE. There's a patch, it's available, and they have promised us that from now on they will consider IE 11 and above to be a generic HTML5 browser, but that's a problem. Same thing on the Windows world. The Windows world, we don't see apps breaking by and large because they just flat out don't work. We see them breaking because they check the user agent string. One of the things that's different for Windows 8.1 is that if you put in a compatibility manifest for a particular OS, the get version API will continue to say that we are that OS by default. So this is the challenge we come from, is the version check and things not behaving correctly. And that's what we found here in this Mockingbird website. And it was actually a little bit more complicated than that. So the first thing I'm going to do to showcase what this issue is I'm going to capture what it's doing in Fiddler. So there's an option in the developer tools to always go, oh, here, I want that, and refresh from the server. And I'm going to refresh it here. Oh, that's awesome. Let me autoresponder. To my rehearsal from yesterday. That's fantastic. Let's try this again. Boop. Now we'll refresh. Hopefully still be broken. Oh, come on. There we go. Now we've got the broken one, and we can go back and see the request that was taking place. Oh, we saw a 404, so it's been loading from cache. The conversation that took place. So here's a 304. That should have not been cached. Always refresh. Boy, I'm having a great demo day, aren't I? We refresh, we're broken. If we go back and take a look and see what the underlying problem is. So from a troubleshooting perspective, here's how we address keeping remediation costs low in IE. Something called document modes. This is something basically no one in the world, not enough people certainly, understand. IE ships not just with IE, right? It's not like there's one browser and that's how it always renders web pages. IE can render a web page like IE5 did, like IE7 did, like IE8 did, like IE9 did, and like IE10 did. This is IE11. All these different ways. Multiple personality disorder, if you will. You have to tell it which way you want it to render. Well, here's what this developer did. They built an HTML5 application, and they said, all right, so if this HTML5 application, it wasn't working on IE because they wrote it when IE8 was the most current version. Okay, so they said, all right, it's not working on IE. I wonder how to make IE work with it. They apparently just did a web search and said, oh, here's this tag that makes its site work with more sites work in IE. So they tried putting this one in. Here's what it actually does. This says behave like IE7 for your HTML5 app. IE7 didn't do HTML5. So even though we do it now, it's broken because they've said, please behave like a browser that doesn't support what you're doing. Let me show you a neat trick, which lets me resolve this pretty quickly. I'm just going to call this mockingbird.htm and show you what I mean by how we're trying to reduce the cost of remediation. If we go in and take a look at what this is, it's saying, please emulate IE7. What they really want is an HTML5 browser. So if I just said, you know what, give me the latest that you've got, IE equals edge. Now let me test it. Now it turns out I don't work for this company, so I can't just go directly onto the server. And even if I did, I like to test things before I deploy them. Fiddler is a tool that lets me simulate that. Fiddler is an HTTP proxy debugger. So I'm in between the browser and my proxy server or directly to the internet, depending upon how I connect. And I can go in and look at it this way. Feed in this response that I modified. And make sure I hit save. And then when I re-navigate to this page and hit refresh, I'll just point out before I hit refresh when it will work. We're working on it and we'll support it very soon. It's been saying that now for over 3 years. So their definition of soon and mine are probably a little bit different. And hit refresh and note that it actually behaves just fine as long as you give it an HTML5 browser. So here's the challenge. A remediation framework lets you behave like all these different browsers. No one knows they're on the hook to do it, though. Problems like this occasionally occur. I'm in the internet, and I asked for something old, and I gave it something old, and then it didn't like it. Well, you got what you asked for. You just asked for the wrong thing. Same thing on the enterprise. The default configuration for the enterprise is behave like you're in compatibility view, IE7. That's the default. All of your internal web pages are going to behave like they're IE7. Great for compatibility, so you don't have to change anything since IE7. What if you're trying to build something on HTML5? If you don't know how to opt out, you won't get it. And why might you want to opt out? Well, maybe you want your stuff to go faster. Here's some measurements I did with IE9. This is the performance comparison between IE9 in all of the 4 different ways it was able to render a web page. Notice any 2 that look a little different? Those are the 2 that you get for your internal applications by default. They are literally 10 times slower in terms of JavaScript performance. So there's definitely some advantages to be had. Other things to think about on the compatibility side, if you're familiar with shims, there is one change to be aware of. And that is, if you are applying shims to an application, those shims, by default, are going to exclude the .NET framework. So if you have Windows Forms applications that you're trying to resolve, and you've done so with shims on Windows 7, moving to Windows 8 or later, those shims may not apply anymore. So if I wanted to do a version check, actually I had to do the version check one before, I would have to include everything to ensure that those shims apply. So there is one very subtle difference in terms of compatibility for any apps I've remediated for Windows 7. Beyond that, it's kind of the same story that it's been for a while on Windows apps. So we started alluding a little bit to HTML5 and opting in, moving forward, getting things running faster. To me, that's the next interesting challenge. When we start talking about getting on Windows 8.1, or even getting on Windows 7 off of Windows XP, we start talking about getting onto the latest versions of IE, the latest versions of Office. If all that my people are doing is still based on legacy technology, are they really getting all of the value out of that platform? Have we stopped and thought about modernizing those applications, and where does it make sense to do that? Because App Compat is all about duct tape. How do I keep my applications going as long as I possibly can? And customers love this. I was talking to customers in Japan a few weeks ago, and they were saying, oh, you guys are just not doing good on App Compat. And I'm like, really? And we were talking specifically about IE, because that's our big escalation point right now. And I said, compared to everybody else puts out a new browser about once every 2 months and says, if your site breaks, go fix it. We've got nothing for you. And we give you document modes, we give you compatibility going forward for years and years and years. How can we be the bad ones on App Compat? And they said, no, I'm not comparing you to Chrome. I'm comparing you to IBM. And I'm like, IBM? You like Notes? Like, I don't even know what you're talking about. They're like, no, the mainframe. This app's been running for 40 years. That's their gold standard. How do we move away from, let's just keep it duct tape and try to get this thing to live for 40 years? Average age of enterprise application, incidentally, is about 12 years still. Right? We're trying to gradually pull that down because they're not designed for it. And how do we start building a modern experience as opposed to a duct tape experience? And the reason why that matters more today is because an inversion in the innovation curve. When we look at what we were doing in the 80s and the 90s, the innovation was coming fast and furious in the platform. If your app could keep up, it got all kinds of features for free. This was back when we were adding things like a TCP/IP stack to the platform. All of a sudden, you had networking, and if your app would run on it, you could get on a network. And you couldn't do that before unless you wrote your own stack. And round about the early 2000s, all of a sudden, it inverted. The features that we added were things like coalescing timers in Windows, which allows you to say, you know what, I don't have to wake up at precisely this time. If you want to save a little bit of battery, I have a tolerance of about this much, so go ahead and take advantage of that. Number one, very few people actually use that, unless they were specifically trying to write something that's targeting a high battery life device. Number two, that's not a killer feature for an app, because people can always attribute low battery life to the device and not take accountability for it. So the innovation started to come into the apps. And the apps got bigger and bigger and bigger. The Taj Mahal, where you're bolting on all of these wings to the application, and it's this huge thing. I worked with a customer that had a 7-year-long implementation project of their app to run their business on top of SAP. 7 years to build a single application. And they got bigger and bigger. And what's been happening recently is that is inverted again, where now the innovation is coming in the platform again. If I can just get to the new version of Windows, touch sucks a whole lot less. If I can get to the new version of IE, I no longer have to put up with the crashes of the add-ins that support my application, because these things are supported natively by the vendor now. So it's no longer a sense of, I need to replace this app because it's old, it's rusty, and old is bad. That's not why we do it. It's because applications are designed as works of engineering. And as works of engineering, they have a lifespan built into them. When you think about a building, another work of engineering, you can build something like the Pantheon that will last for thousands of years. It's expensive. You have to get real stone, and you've got to put it together really well, and you have to maintain it periodically. Or you can build something to last less time. This is designed to look like ancient Greco-Roman architecture. This is from the St. Louis World's Fair, a 1-year-long event. This had to last 1 year, so they didn't build it out of stone. They built it out of plaster of Paris and hemp. And they had to patch it a lot more often, and after it was done, it was too expensive to maintain it. The same thing is true of software. Software is designed to be maintainable for a certain amount of time. It's not that it's gone bad, it's that it gets too expensive to maintain it. And the question to ask is this application I'm running for 12 years really designed to be maintainable for 12 years? Because I don't know about you, the typical release pattern I see from a lot of development organizations is, all right, did it compile? Yes? All right, go ahead and ship it. That's the criteria that gets applied. Look at what we did as an example for Windows 7. Windows 7 designed to be maintainable for 10 years. The full product cycle on that was 3 years. You know how much of that was actual engineering time? 3 months. 3 months of engineering on Windows 7. The rest was planning beforehand, and it was bug fixes, tests, performance tests, improvements, testing, user tests, all these other aspects of making it supportable so we could come back and say, you know what, all right, we're shipping this in 2009. In 2019, we'll still be able to run this and fix it and be able to stand behind it. It's engineering. And this is the sort of mindset we need to move away from, which is the old mindset of everything is defined and crisply put together. We have managed operations. We have defined processes. We have an enclosed room. This is how most enterprise organizations have a tendency to try and revert to. It's comfortable. It's familiar. And we need to realize and apply the law of holes, which is this. When you realize you are in a hole, it is time to stop digging. And we need to think about how do we conceptualize what applications ought to be doing today to generate business value. Is there business value in supporting more form factors than we do today? More than just the desktop PC and the laptop PC. Are there scenarios where I can involve touch? Are there scenarios where I can involve a handheld device? Where does it make sense? Do I want to give people access outside of the organization? Can I break that notion? And one that's interesting that I think we've really just begun to scratch the surface on is the concept of social. Social, not in the sense of, hey, you should be able to tweet from everything. I don't think that's interesting. Social in the sense that you connect people. This is a diagram taken from the work of an MIT researcher who looks at the network of information and how you can measure the complexity of a society by the extent to which knowledge is distributed across the society. Think, for example, of how you make a PC. How many of you can make a PC completely by yourself without any help? Meaning you can go out and just mine the metal. You know how to mine and dig metal out of the ground and then smelt it. Of course, that's the pretty easy part. And then beat it into wires of an appropriate size and build a whole PC, right? This knowledge, no one person can do all of these things. And the same thing is true of any complex organization. When we think about App Compat testing as one example, there's this tendency to say, App Compat team, you go test it. I know I have people ask me for it all the time. Hey, just constantly running App Compat tests on these things. And I'm like, well, we don't know how this software works. We don't have logins that work for them. And even if we did, we don't know what this thing does. You're having me test engineering software, right? I had one example of an App Compat issue, which was in a plugin for SolidWorks, which is a 3D design. So SolidWorks was okay. The plugin was not okay. The plugin was designed to help you build screws to go into oil rigs, and it turns out to have failed when you tried to design a screw that had greater than 8,000 vertices. I was never going to find that bug, but every single mechanical engineer designing screws to go into oil rigs found it almost immediately, because apparently it takes at least that many vertices to make an actual functioning screw for an oil rig. That information is distributed across the network. We need to learn how to harness it, not to bring it all together. Navigate a network, and that happens through social. And that's something we're still learning how to do. I was in TechEd New Zealand a few weeks ago, and one of their keynote speakers was talking about how they're able to look at information across a network and start to build these graphs to do a lot of interesting information around mining information already captured in the network that's gone undetected so far. That's what I think about in social. I don't think about Facebook and Twitter. I think about being able to find and bring knowledge together in new and interesting ways. When I think about modern apps, I think about how expectations have changed, right? We no longer have SLAs on the order of days. We have SLAs on the order of seconds. Emails down for 10 seconds at Microsoft, and people are calling the help desk. Because it's a different place now. Are our apps able to respond to that? And we get there by first going through a process of application management. Because most of the customers I talk to, when they're thinking about a deployment to a new platform, they look at, all right, well, what are the apps I have? Because I don't know. Well, how can you manage what you don't know? So I always start the conversation and then say, all right, well, first of all, we need to figure out what you should be testing. We need to figure out what you should care about. You don't need to discover everything you have, particularly if you're talking about Office or the web, because there's probably tens or hundreds of millions of things. We should figure out what you should care about. Those are the things that are subject to structured testing, the ones I'm going to look at beforehand and put some kind of guarantee behind. I like to further tier them by, I kind of use an Olympic medal sort of analogy, platinum, gold, silver, bronze. Treat my applications differently. My platinum apps, I may do a full regression test on. My gold apps, I may do quite a bit of install and launch testing and poke around a bit. My silver apps, I'll probably fire them up. My gold apps, I'll probably let a pilot user find the issues there. I'll have a whole separate bin of supported applications. Most IT organizations don't have the power to say you cannot install anything I haven't approved. Some can. Those don't seem like the happiest places. But you can say, you know what, all right, you can install it. If you have a problem, call us up. We'll help you get going because we want you to keep working. But we're not going to sign up to do all kinds of expensive testing on your stuff when we didn't buy it in the first place, right? Your ability to get something installed does not equal our willingness to support it forever. But we will help you out to unblock the business. And then there will be other things I simply won't care about. From here, we look at figuring out how to better govern my applications, understanding how to get things nominated to be supported, and how to really deeply understand what is driving my business and what should I be investing in, and am I using my platform to drive that. So a few things to start with right away, right? Typical initial conversations were on license management, and this started around 2008. The financial collapse, all of a sudden people were buying less software, so the software companies, because we're smart like that, decided, if you're not buying new software, let's go find some of our old software that maybe you haven't paid for yet. So all of a sudden, the ability to go through and figure out what you haven't paid for and pay for it ahead of time or remove it so you didn't have to pay penalties and blah, 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 became a driver to help avoid all the gremlins out there sort of trying to shake you down for whatever extra money they could get. But I think there's more proactive benefits to be gained from being strategic around the software you're running and how it applies to your business, as well as beginning to apply some quality criteria for the software you're going to run. It compiles is not an adequate criteria for shipping software across a 20,000 person organization. You should be able to say something more. In the web, for example, 70% of web applications are running an IE5 Quirks mode, a 1999 implementation of web standards. 50% of enterprise web applications, of enterprise Windows applications are written in Visual Basic 6. The development environment has not been supported since 2008. The runtime still is, so you're okay. That's grandfathering, but I don't want to be making new stuff. I'd like to have a check that says, oh, you're shipping a new app? Yeah, you can't make a new VB6 app, not today. We're not putting a new one out there. The old stuff, yeah, we're grandfathered in, we'll keep it there, but no new stuff. That's an application quality criteria. We're going to say we need to go through and put in some baseline standards. So we look at some lightweight ways to get started with this, because obviously you can go all the way and have a thorough app management solution, but we say, you know what, we'll start off with quick assessments, figure out the urgent problems, understand the important problems, and continue trying to tie it back to business value. This is the evolution that technology people are going through now, which is everything has to be tied to business value. The days are gone when we can just say this is technically interesting, so we're going to do it. People are looking for business justifications. Across the board, technologists continue to have to get broader and broader. You can no longer be an on-premises infrastructure person. You have to know about the cloud a little bit. Packaging people are learning about App Compat, which is a little bit about app dev, which is typically outside of most people's comfort zone. Application developers are learning about manageability. That's outside of their comfort zone. Everybody is extending, and extending into business value is one of the extensions that gets the biggest payoff. We're also persuading the business and understanding that we can't necessarily quantify everything in terms of hard dollars. Some of it's soft. And I like this quote: conservative accountants who assign zero value to many intangible benefits prefer being precisely wrong to being vaguely right. I've met a lot of people like this. If you start doing this, the cost of managing it goes down. And he's like, oh, really? Who do I get to fire? I'm like, no. That means you're going to start investing more money in things that are proactive. You'll start doing things like taking more risks. More risks equal more rewards. You will start looking at investing less in the infrastructure and more in your applications. You can begin to look at building more new technology as opposed to keeping your existing stuff on life support. And you can look at continuing to move more quickly by having more investments in those systems that help you innovate and differentiate from your competition. The thing to be mindful of across the board is that at some point, everything becomes irrelevant. And we need to understand when it's good to be durable and when it's not. I talked about VB6 earlier. VB6, by the time it's done, we introduced it in 1998. We've already announced that we support it through the lifetime of Windows 8, assuming we don't extend it to Windows 9. I have no idea if we will or not. This is not an announcement. But even if it's just Windows 8, that's going to take us through until 2022. So by the time it goes away, it will have lived longer than Buddy Holly did. an American musician, longer than the Betamax, longer than even Windows XP. It feels like that's been around forever. That's a long time. But that doesn't necessarily mean that sticking around a long time is good. One of my bugaboos to deal with today is Java. This is actual exploits going against known vulnerabilities. The blue line at the top, the #1 most attacked platform in all of technology today, Java. What does every company I've ever spoken with choose for a Java standard? One particular update level of one particular version, and they only reconsider it once every few years. So they are deliberately and intentionally choosing to stay on known vulnerable technology instead of keeping it up to date. That's dangerous, right? We want to have a grandfather strategy that lets things keep around, but not one that does so at the expense of security. Why do we want to modernize? How do we make that business case? Well, some of the things are, a bit of the stick. Things are going out of support. But we also have the option to start innovating and building better experiences. Here's an interesting value proposition I helped one customer build. They said, let's go to HTML5. How are we going to justify that? Well, they said, well, it's a bit more terse. So we can take this HTML4, bare bones, there's almost nothing in that, and start making it HTML5. We haven't taken advantage of new features. All we've said is, let's shorten that doc type down, let's shorten the HTML declaration down, we'll shorten the character set declaration, we'll shorten the style sheet link, and we'll end up with that. And in that process, we will have shrunk it from 412 to 188 characters. So 412 minus 188, 224 characters per web request that I don't have to send, and they weren't adding any value. And if I make an average of 2,000 web requests a day, and I have 30,000 people, and I do that for a year, over the course of that year, I will save that many bytes of transmission over my network. I got to pay for that bandwidth, I'll have that many K, that many meg, that many gig, 45,000 gigabytes a year we saved of network traffic just by changing that, right? It's boring, but there's business value in going to modern technologies. And when I think about how to do it, kind of 3 different options. I can sort of take and port, right? Move it as is, so it's not on our new platform. I can redesign it, or I can re-envision it. Reimagine what this solution could be and take it from the start. That's the one I love to do, one that starts looking at building a really terrific experience, really terrific design that just really engages people. And I think that's where we still need to make terrific examples of that. Office 365 is finally starting to take some advantage of HTML5 to build those differentiating experiences. But besides that, we still have a lot of really consumer-level examples. When someone says natural user interface, we then show you something that looks a lot like this, right? The Connect. It's really kind of neat. But when I think about Connect as a user interface model, and I think about where I usually work, it doesn't work so well. So how do we build more examples? I think we have the opportunity to showcase what a modern application can do. When I think about agility, a caution I will give is that highly customizing your environment is starting to become the enemy. My team, for example, in the issues that we investigated, we found that roughly 10% of the bugs that are reported to us, enterprise app compat bugs, did not repro in a vanilla environment. It's something about the customer's configuration. And IE turns out to be particularly challenging on this. And we tried to figure out why, and it didn't take us too long. We look at how manageable IE is, quote unquote. There are over 1,500 group policies, and the actual number of permutations of those group policies is this number. By way of comparisons, the number of molecules in the observable universe is this number. And it turns out we don't have that many test cases. So nearly every configuration you can come up with, if you go one by one and try to pick the best option, no one in the history of mankind has ever or will ever see again, so we don't know what's going to happen. If you turn off UAC, for example, since UAC is required in Windows 8 to use a modern app, we make it really hard to turn off. You still can. The slider doesn't do it anymore. but you can go into the group policies and turn it off there. Do you know how many tests we run with UAC disabled? None. So if you find something, we'll be like, oh, okay, that's news to us. We never looked at it. Staying in the default configuration gets you tested, and that saves money. And that saves confusion. So as we bring this all together, I think we have an opportunity to think differently about what an app is and about what we're delivering, right? To solve scenarios instead of thinking of these giant megalithic apps. I think we need to be more mindful of externalities. So one of the solutions that comes up as one example is, hey, we can solve this problem, maybe web browser compatibility, we'll just give you 2 web browsers. Well, that's an externality. Now you're making the user pick which browser to use for which app. Oh, this app doesn't really work on this, I'll just put it on Citrix. Okay, well now the user has a different application launch paradigm for some apps than for others. There's a subtle cost to that. Doesn't mean we shouldn't take it, doesn't mean it's not the right decision, but it just means we need to incorporate that cost as we think about that and begin to think about how we can lead this transformation, if you will, to stop thinking about software, but think about services, or I prefer to think of it as experiences. And that is the challenge I think lies before us. An opportunity to deliver more reliably applications through packages that deliver to the right solution, to the right people, more reliably. With that, I would like to thank you all for coming for this very early in the morning session, or at least early for nerds. The session code in this one is KN11. They are giving away a pretty cool little helicopter. My best friend actually has one of those and has sent me some pictures. It's actually kind of neat. And his son absolutely loves it. His son is 11 years old, which is apparently the absolute perfect age to have a little flying helicopter thing. Thank you very much for coming, and enjoy the rest of the conference.